Hey guys, it's Sabby Sabs, and I have a special guest with me today. Her name is Erika Uyterhoeven. She's a Democratic Socialist, and she's a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives for the 27th Middlesex District. Hi, Erika.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. So, Erika, before we get started, can you tell everyone a little bit about your background?
Yeah, for sure. In terms of just like, what brought me to running for office and being where I am now, that kind of background. Yeah, I think so. I kind of had I guess, a meandering path to politics. It was not something I thought I was going to get into, early on in life. But I had prior to this worked as an antitrust economist. So I did a lot of work analyzing data on, when corporations break the rules of the market. And that was a pretty radicalizing experience in itself, because the reality is corporations are doing a lot more than breaking rules of the market. And, if we don't change the rules, right, nothing is going to change. And so that's really kind of what brought me towards politics initially. And I worked on the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, took a sabbatical as an organizer. And that was really kind of I guess, radicalizing experience for me, both in terms of, I think that campaign broke the spell of neoliberalism, right, for our whole country, and what is possible, right, and what is the role of government and what it means to have all of our needs met. But also it was radicalizing as an individual for me, because it really shifted how I positioned myself in the world. When we won the New Hampshire primary by the largest margin in over 50 years, right, it became really clear to me that not only do we want these things to change, but it's my responsibility to make them happen, right, as an organizer and through organizing in politics. Rather than, I think before that, my orientation was like, I was taught to, get a good job. My mom always wanted me to have a white collar job in an office building, try to do your best, right, and like really, provide for your family, which is not to say that's not a noble thing to do, but my perspective on politics and sort of the world we live in and around climate crisis, right, how having Medicare for all of these issues became not just issues that like happen to me, but that I have a responsibility to change them. And so I think since then I've essentially really couldn't go back to business as usual. So I got involved in state level advocacy, and co-founded Act en Masse, and then here I am as I'm a state representative. So that's a little bit about just my journey here in politics.
Yeah, so my husband and I, like, we were really rooting for you, like when you were
Oh,
running.
thank
We
you.
saw like your debates and
Yeah.
followed your campaign. So I get to tell you in person, congrats.
Oh, thank you.
And then also, like, as someone who lives in Somerville, so my husband and I actually just recently left Somerville because like we bought a house, but we were very familiar with how Somerville has changed like over the past couple of years.
Yes.
Um, One of the things that you had on your platform was public education.
Mm-hmm.
So you wanted to guarantee universal pre-K. Can you
Yes.
tell everybody, like, why is this significant?
I mean, I think education overall is just this foundational building block of our democracy. Our democracy hinges on it. And interesting enough, Massachusetts is actually the world's home to public education. We were the first place in the world to have, there were a lot of problems with it, not to say, right, it was only for white people and only, all these issues, like, of course, right, like that. But like in the 1800s, we were the first to make public education a real thing. And to me, universal pre-K as well as debt-free higher ed and, equitably funding our public schools, all three of those in terms of ensuring that we are putting where our what I say is like our budgets is where our values are, right? And I believe our values should be where democracy is, and in particular with public education, there has been a ongoing intentional and concerted assault against public education over the past decades in terms of trying to disinvest in it, trying to come up with these commodified versions of how we can do, public education on the cheap in a way, as well as, right, trying to turn the field of education, right, as particularly for educators, into something that is a revolving door rather than something that we invest in, and it makes it a really clear, part of our community. And it is, right, it is one of our last strongholds of of the public sector. I mean, there's others, but this is one of the last, strong, big ones. And so I think that that's something that I believe we need to be expanding public education. And that's why, for me, pre-K, universal pre-K is so important. And then I think the other side of that coin, right, is in terms of who needs this most, right? When you look, and you mentioned Somerville, right? We had the highest increase in housing prices than anywhere else in the state. So we are rapidly gentrifying. The displacement crisis is real, as well as the affordable housing crisis. And when you look at the average, any person who lives in Somerville, their expenses, right? First there's housing, and then if you have kids, it's childcare and education, right? And so that's really something that is driving families out of Somerville, is that they just cannot afford that. And, cost of preschool is a huge, it's the fact that we make it something that isn't publicly available, right, makes it a problem of equity and who has access to pre-K and on. I think it's really clear when you look at any other, country, right, like, especially look at Europe, right? I mean, there is universal pre-K is a given, right? It starts at age 3. And that's, we know all the, studies around how beneficial that is, but I think that, the real thing is around, right, how do we set up an equitable public education system? And that if we say, oh, education starts at kindergarten, it doesn't, right? We all know that it starts much earlier. And so we need to make sure that we're actually funding that and expanding public education for all, and equitable public education, so that everyone has the same, access to a high quality education.
Exactly. I know you've talked about public transportation, and for those who don't live in the Boston area, public transportation is like a big issue here. But I know you wanted to expand the MBTA, and also try to make this free as well. For people who don't live in the Boston area, can you explain to people, why is this so important?
Yeah, I think transit is a human right, and transit is a massive, we call equalizer, right? And I will say, when I talk about equitable school funding, right, what means is that there is disinvestment in some communities, which is very clear. We have been underfunding, right, BIPOC communities, low-income communities in public education. And the same exact argument can be made for public transport, particularly in the greater Boston area. When you look at the MBTA lines, right, like, where have we avoided, right? Where do we only serve bus lines, right, versus the subway? So to me, right, like, making sure that we can provide public transportation for all, right, for all workers, for all working people, is incredibly important, because that is a piece of a critical part of our infrastructure, right, and how people are able to get by in their lives and all that stuff. So I think that is, and I think there was a really, I can't pull up the number right now, but there was a study around, right, the disparity by race and class in terms of how much time you spend on public transit for someone, based on those factors. And it's abominable. We should not, this should be something that's, again, equitable and accessible to all. And so to me, that's a really key part of what we need to have in the greater Boston area. And I'll add another aspect of it too, is that it's a big climate crisis issue, because our largest carbon emission comes from transportation in the greater Boston area. So ensuring that everyone has access to transportation, which I think is just a basic right, but also, if we want to be serious about environmental justice and the climate crisis, right, and curbing our carbon emissions, we need to look at transportation. Absolutely, we need to be fixing that. So I think that's something that is so important, particularly in the greater Boston area, and particularly also as people get pushed out, right, of the city, which shouldn't happen to begin with, but as it's happening, right, we need to be expanding those services. Because one thing that people overlook with the affordable housing or displacement crisis is they're like, well, just find somewhere else to live. Right. Do you understand, when someone has relied on the systems that we have today, and someone's a senior who is, has less options for mobility and all these, and you're saying just find a different place, outside of where there's public transit. That completely upends people's daily lives. And so it's so important that, one, we don't allow the displacement crisis to move forward, but also we provide those opportunities for people, because mobility is a fundamental human right for everyone to be able to access. And so that's why it's such a clear issue in the greater Boston area. And I'll just add one more thing too, because particularly around vaccine equity, right, is one thing that's come up. And when we had, right, for a long period of time, things keep fluctuating, and it's persistently frustrating. But, at first it was like, hey, everyone in Somerville, just go to Gillette Stadium. if you win the lottery, that is, if you win the lottery on the website. And it was like, okay, so you want the most vulnerable, right, senior residents to take multiple lines of public transportation to get to Gillette, or to get to Fenway. That just shows you, right? Like if we had invested in public transportation, we'd be in a very different place. But also, right, we need to think about transportation equity in just that problem alone. And I think I pick out the vaccine as like, one trip that people need to make to get there, right? But that is the case with like anything in terms of our daily needs and our daily lives, right? Whether it's food, whether it's, getting to work, whether it's to get to your doctor's appointment, right? These are all things that transportation hinges on. And that's why transportation equity is such a key issue for us.
No, agreed. I know a couple years ago, Marty Walsh said vote with your feet, because they were trying to make it so that the T, for those who don't live in Boston, like the T is our public transportation system, our subway system, to make sure that they would stay open later, because we are not a 24-hour public transportation system like you have in New York. We don't have that here. And so I often wondered, like, how do people who work third shift, right, and they don't have a car, how are they getting back and forth to work? I've always wondered that.
Yeah, I mean, it really limits people's options, right? I mean, I'll just share like a very small anecdote from my university. They were charging the food service workers there like the same price for parking as like the rest of, the students and faculty, which is, by the way, like there's like a monthly pass. I don't know the cost, but it was something, they charged me like $20 to park there a day, right? So it's like, that's where like the equity piece becomes so important, because then it's like, so you've only given them the option to drive, and then this driving option is incredibly regressive, right? Is that it causes, invokes even more costs on working people. So it's just another piece of the inequities of the system, right? And then it's like assuming you have a car, right? And then what if your car breaks down, right? And so all these issues, they all kind of are intertwined with this public transit issue. And I think you're totally right. I mean, we need to be ensuring that people have access for it when they need it. And so, and I've always thought that the like T closing at 12:30 was quite early. I've also lived in parts of the world where like it's open to like 2 or 3 a.m., right? To your point, right? On the third shifts, it's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we want to, use our imagination to see what kind of transportation is truly equitable, and how can we build a T that really fulfills all those needs.
Exactly. Now, I know you talked about defunding the police, especially in incidents with mental health, crisis. We've seen these situations just go terribly wrong and very badly when police officers show up to deal with mental health situations. What do you propose would be a better option?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. And I take it from an abolitionist lens of, what does it take for us to have true public safety and true public health, right? If we centered on safety and health, right? Rather than a lens of criminalization, right? Which I think is sort of the defense line as to like, well, we need to have police. You need to have someone with a gun. What if your body's in danger? And the reality is, when we talk about true public safety, the question is, are we addressing all these underlying reasons why we had to call public, safety or public, in the first place, right? And that usually who shows up is the police, right? And my view is that like, all right, let's say you have a case of a mental health crisis or domestic violence or even theft, right? I mean, that's not a mental health crisis. But, what is underlying what happened, right? And are we actually addressing those underlying issues? And so that brings to question, right? If we're going to if we want to respond to those underlying issues rather than kind of using a blunt tool of criminalization, then we're asking ourselves, well, then what were the needs of why people were brought in to begin with, right? And a lot of those needs are, well, we need more mental health counselors. We need more public health in general, right? Like we need, I'll just say as someone who worked as an EMT, right? We were bringing people to the emergency room who shouldn't have been going to, the emergency room was the only thing I could bring them to, but really what they needed was ongoing counseling or ongoing healthcare, right? And support. And so those are things that we are disinvesting in while we're spending so much money on policing and the prison industrial complex, right? And so those are things that, just as examples, how to get to those underlying issues. I would even take that argument even further, right? When you have incidents of theft, for example, or, some kind of, that sort of situation. The question is like, now, what kind of equitable or, what kind of inequality in our society do we have that leads to people to have to be acting on that, right? And like, why was there a theft to begin with, right? Those are the questions we need to be asking rather than saying, presuming immediately, oh, some people are good and some people are bad. And really the whole like underlying notion of like the institution of policing and in prisons, right, is saying there are good people and there are bad people, and we need to punish the bad people. And, an abolitionist lens says, look, we have underlying problems, right, that people are facing with. How do we solve those problems? How do we put our resources towards, right, actual harm reduction, right, actual healing, right, rather than a response that is, I would say, actually perpetuates the problem even further, right? It does not actually provide solutions for any of those kind of three cases that I put forward, right? It doesn't solve the problem of poverty or needing needs met, right? Or making sure like basic needs are met. It doesn't solve the problem of needing, counseling or healing around mental health crises or really any crisis, right? I mean, in terms of support, and I bring that up with, other cases. So I think that's the key to me about what defund the police means, is that we're actually allocating our resources to solving those problems rather than looking at crime and busting crime as my more conservative counterparts will say, right, is that we actually need to be providing those resources to solve those problems rather than saying this is the only solution forward, which I don't think has ever been the case. And that's led us to an increased militarization of policing, prisons, and as well as spending abroad, right? And so I think that's something that we need to reformulate, right, how we approach these problems. And that's why for me, I was very vocal about being for defunding the police, because it's really about addressing human needs. And how do we actually allocate those resources in society? And I would argue public education is another one as well, right, related to that, rather than having, police in our schools. Is that really solving an underlying problem, or do we need counseling support? Do we need more, social workers? Do we need more, paraprofessionals and people who support our students, right, rather than criminalizing them? I mean, I think that's the student to prison pipeline is like a later stage version of what we've kind of gone down this path of like criminalizing every problem, right, when they're actually health issues or issues that we need to have support for.
Agreed. Now, I know you're for Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that this is even more important now during a time when we are in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes.
So many people don't have health insurance and didn't have health insurance before COVID happened. What's your response to people, like when people come back and say they're going to take our healthcare away? How do you respond to that in reference to Medicare for all?
Yeah, the taking of healthcare away. I mean, I think the reality is that we're not here to take healthcare away, right? We're here to ensure that everyone has access to healthcare, right? At the very, very, very least. And I think there's kind of this argument that came up during the presidential campaign. I'm trying to remember. It was like, people were saying, well, our union fought so hard for our healthcare plans, and now you're trying to take those away from us, right? And my view on that is like, well, then everyone should be represented by a union, right? We have very low union membership, right? Like, why wouldn't you want everyone to have the things that you have, right? And then why are we looking at this from a scarcity mindset? Why can't we have your health plan, but for everyone? Why is it something that only we get to have, right, and not other people, right? And so I think that's my response, is that like, I want everyone to have that, the health plan that unions fought for. And in fact, right, if we had much higher unionization, unlike what's happened over the past 30 years, we'd be in a very different place. More people would. But the thing with universal health care is that we believe everybody deserves it, regardless of what situation or position you're in. And I think the other piece I'll say too, in response to like, you're trying to take our healthcare away, if there's anything that if you want to take sort of like a spending lens to, right, comparatively to other countries, we as United States spend more per healthcare than almost any other developed country in the world, and have the worst results for it, right, in terms of life expectancy, any health indicators. And particularly, I think one thing that's important to look at is that this is, again, with all issues, it's a racial justice issue. And you look at the disparity by race, just in the Boston area, the gap between the lowest and highest life expectancy, which is, by the way, within like 1 or 2 miles apart, is over 15 years. I mean, that's right, that's the outcome of a broken healthcare system and an inequitable one. And so, I urge that, like, one, not only is universal healthcare the right thing to do, taking insurance companies and the whole kind of for-profit healthcare system out of the equation means we're not going to be actually spending all this money, right? Because it's like, why are we spending all of this when you look at every other country that has some form of universal healthcare? I mean, we can debate on the margins, but right, some form of universal healthcare. What are we doing wrong is the real question. And then, taking ourselves out of the scarcity mindset, imagine if we put that same amount of money that we spend today, right, to a system that works, we would have the best healthcare in the world for everyone. I mean, that's what the numbers are showing to me, right? And so that's, I think, the world we want to work towards. And how do we make it so everyone has the same, privileges that we may have based on, our life or our experiences. So, yeah.
Agreed. All right, Erika, I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
What advice would you give someone who is thinking about running for office?
That's a good question. Here's what I'll say. For running for office, it's a job that anyone can do. It's not a question of can, it's a question of should. And I say that because when you ask me, for anyone running for office, overwhelmingly, right, women, BIPOC folks, queer folks get hung up on the can I run. The question is not, can you do the job? Anyone can do this job. And in fact, anyone does as things stand today, right? But the question is should. And when you ask the question of should, right, that's something that says, I don't believe in waiting for one's turn, right? There's this sort of like culture around that in Massachusetts, especially of like, wait till, a seat opens up and all that. The question is is the person who's representing you today, the person who should be representing you? And are you the person who could be representing people better? Right. And so I think that to me is like kind of my best advice I can give people, because I see over and over again, people get caught up on the question of can I represent versus should I represent? And the should I is the much more, the deeper question, right? And also it hinges more on values rather than like what are societally defined, cans, right? Do I have a law degree? Did I run for office before? Did I do all the things to prepare me for this moment? The reality is no one's ever prepared when they run for office. That's the kind of like secret that no one tells. And I think that if people ask more questions around should I run for office rather than can I, right? We eliminate all those kind of internal, right, imposter syndrome type stuff that comes up that I know, again, our paler, maler, and staler counterparts never seem to trip over. And then that, the should I is the question around what kind of world we believe in, and that we all have a responsibility to build the world we want to see. And so that's the kind of my best advice, is to encourage people to think about the should rather than the can I, because I'm tired of seeing people that absolutely should be holding public office not even taking the first step because they get caught up on that first question rather than the second one.
Well said. All right, everyone. I'll be sure to put the link to Erika's website in the description below. Erika, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me.